Good morning. I'm Lawrence MacDonald from the Center for Global Development, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this very special event on behalf of CGD and the Tony Blair Africa Governance Initiative. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Nancy Birdsall, the founding president of the Center for Global Development. As many of you know, Nancy is well known for her research and writing on a wide variety of development issues, and in particular for her insistence that the policies and practices of the rich countries, the emerging powers, and the international institutions can make a huge difference for good or for ill in the lives of poor people in the developing world. It's that vision that motivates our work at the Center, and I know it's a belief that we share with today's guest speaker. Please welcome Nancy Birdsall.
Thank you very much, Lawrence, for saying such good things about me and, more important, about our mission at the Center for Global Development. I am, of course, very pleased, honored to have this opportunity to welcome and introduce the Right Honorable Tony Blair. I am pleased but not surprised to see such a large, distinguished, and well-informed audience. I know who you are from the list. That has turned out to hear him today, despite today's weather. Many of you will not know that the snow is now accumulating. I also want to extend a special welcome and thank you to Ed Scott, the chairman of the CGD board, who started this process by extending an invitation that brought Tony Blair to us today. I'm very pleased that the Center for Global Development has had the opportunity to organize today's event in partnership with the African Governance Initiative, which Tony Blair founded and leads, and which you will hear more about shortly. During his tenure as the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Tony Blair pushed the issues of development and the well-being of Africa in particular, as no Western leader had done before, or indeed since. In his new book, A Journey, My Political Life, he explains this commitment, quoting from a speech he gave soon after the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001. Quote, "If globalization works only for the benefit of the few, it will fail, and it will deserve to fail. But if we follow the principles that have served us so well at home, that power and wealth and opportunity should be in the hands of the many, then globalization will be a force for good and a movement we should take pride in leading." Throughout his, unquote, throughout his time in office and since leaving office, Tony Blair has worked to make that shared global prosperity a reality. One of his first acts after taking office was to appoint Claire Short as the Minister of State for Development, and to make the UK Department for International Development, DFID to its many friends and admirers, an independent cabinet-level agency. This is something that we in the United States development community have been urging for many years, so far without success. Claire Short was a powerful advocate for development internationally and one of 4 women ministers who comprised the Utstein Group. They were the winner of CGD's first annual Commitment to Development Award in 2003. Another lasting legacy of Tony Blair's tenure is the stern review of the economics of climate change by economist Nicholas Stern. Commissioned and released by the British government, it is the largest, most widely discussed report of its kind. It shows that the benefits of strong early action on climate change massively can outweigh the costs. In office, Tony Blair championed the findings, and since leaving office, he has launched an international initiative aimed at breaking the climate deadlock. Of course, climate is not only a development issue, but we all know that the impacts of climate change hit poor people first and worst. Indeed, we can already see these impacts in events perhaps like the Pakistan floods. Tony Blair's climate advocacy is, in that sense, development advocacy, and I thank him for these efforts. Throughout his time in office, Tony Blair devoted special attention to Africa. With his leadership, the Glen Eagle Summit of 2005 marked a high point in G8 attention to Africa's concerns, including an ambitious agreement to write off the entire $40 billion debt owed by 18 highly indebted poor countries, mostly African, to the World Bank, the IMF, and the African Development Fund. He also used the bully pulpit of his office to create and nurture the Commission for Africa, an effort that laid the groundwork for the African Governance Initiative, our co-organizers for today's event. The African Growth Initiative is pioneering a new way of working with African countries, equipping committed African leaders with people and the kind of help that matters to deliver the public services which their citizens have a right to expect, to tackle deep-rooted poverty, and to attract the sustainable investment to build strong economies for the future. It's an impressive record. Mr. Prime Minister, Tony Blair, thank you for joining us today. We are all looking forward very much to your remarks.
Thank you very much indeed, Nancy. Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be with you here. Can I say a special word of appreciation to Nancy for all the magnificent work that she has done over the years, to the wonderful Ed Scott, whose brainchild the Center for Global Development was, and to the center itself, actually, which has now become a kind of world leader in the development space. And thank you for those very kind remarks about my time in office on development. Actually, I remember when we first set up DFID, Department for International Development, and we did set it up as an independent department, and my goodness, it was. Which is maybe why some of the other leaders find it a little hard, but actually, although just from time to time it was, let's say, challenging, and often rightly, actually, its very independence, funnily enough, did allow it to be innovative and groundbreaking in a way that otherwise I don't think it would have been. So, and I'll say a little bit more about that when I get into my remarks. And what I'm going to do is to speak for roughly 20 minutes. I think then we're going to do some question and answer, and to try and describe not just the work that my Africa Governance Initiative does, but set that in the context of where I think the development debate in the world is today. And this is absolutely the right moment for a debate about development, and there's no organization better than the Center for Global Development to be doing it. There are many reasons why this is indeed the right time. There is a debate about virtually every other aspect of government policy today in the developed world. We're all debating, both my way and your way, reanalyzing, often from first principles, traditional systems of welfare and education, healthcare, and of course the economy. And we're debating them with many of the same themes recurring. A hand up, not a handout. Public sector spending matched by reform. New ways of working, new frameworks of accountability, and new ideas about how to make government more effective, more strategic, and more geared to getting things done. So in all this great analysis and reanalysis of policy, it would be odd if development policy were excluded. And of course it isn't, and it shouldn't be. It is just as much in need as every aspect of policy, of perpetual intellectual spring cleaning. Fortunately, just at the appropriate moment, there has arrived also a new batch of development leaders willing to break new ground. Bob Zoellick at the World Bank, Helen Clark at the UNDP, Raj Shah at USAID, Cathy Ashton and Andris Piebalgs at the EU Commission, and even Andrew Mitchell in the new government, building, of course, on the very strong work of his predecessors. But in all cases, They are prepared to think anew, to work with the private sector, and to escape old mindsets. Then there are, of course, great actors like the Clinton Global Initiative, the Gates Foundation, George Soros' Open Society Institute, David Sainsbury's Gatsby Foundation, and a host of eager private sector investors who want to do good business in a proper way, bringing real and enduring benefits to their host nations. The important thing, though, is that these are matched by a new generation of African leaders in government, in society, in business. And my charity, the Africa Governance Initiative, works at the moment in 3 countries, soon expand to more. But in all 3, I notice a younger generation determined to take the country's future into their own hands, impatient with those who blame the present on the past, and eager to learn and apply the lessons of other governments from around the world. And they, in particular, want a partnership, not a donor-recipient relationship with those with whom they work. Africa's future is a strategic interest for all of us. The Presidential Policy Directive on Global Development and the new State Department Quadrennial Diplomacy and Development Review are emphatic, indeed groundbreaking, on this point, and rightly. If you look at security or resources, food, water, you name it, and any of these subjects gives us an interest in how Africa develops. Now, my charity, AGI, focuses on one thing: building effective systems of capacity to govern. And a few preliminary points, perhaps, to clear away any misinterpretations are necessary. I am not arguing that capacity is more important than democracy. It isn't. Indeed, as I shall argue, the two are linked. I'm not arguing either that aid doesn't matter. It does. When I was British Prime Minister, I trebled aid to Africa and made, as Nancy was saying, increases in aid and debt cancellation the centerpiece of the 2005 G8 summit. Aid does work. It has brought real and profound benefits to poor people, and increasingly so in recent years. The dead aid thesis makes some valid points, but it shouldn't define how we view development. However, I am arguing that without building effective capacity, without governments capable of delivering practical things and on a path to release from dependency on aid, then aid can only ever be a palliative, vital to many, but not transformative of a nation. It is precisely this thinking that has led to concepts like cash on delivery, which I support. However, it is crucial for another reason. As the 20th century clashes of fundamentalist political ideology recede, and as the post-war experiments in large government structures start to yield certain undeniable lessons, I think, though many might disagree with me, there isn't so much dispute today as to what works and what doesn't. In one way, the vision thing, as I think it was once called by one of your American presidents, is very often the easy part. Where you need to get to is reasonably obvious. What is really hard is getting there and getting things done. It is the nuts and bolts of policy. It is strategy. It is performance management. It is delivery. It's the right expertise in the right place. It's ministers who can focus. It's organizing and communicating. This is, in fact, true for governments in developed nations. So how much more is it true for governments in sub-Saharan Africa? You know, when I travel around Africa and I see there's plenty of great reports setting out 2020 or 2030 visions, and read them, and you'll find 150 priorities in there. And you will find bold imperatives to do this or to do that, sometimes somewhat divorced from the political realities. However, what you will also, I'm afraid, often find in the daily mechanisms of government is simply not the capability, the people or the systems to make things happen. And this is where there is a big challenge for us interested in development policy, not just what we do to build capacity, but how we do it. More innovative, more enterprising, and I think more politically connected. And here briefly, it will be brief, are 7 areas I think we should work on. First, I believe we have to help build a strong center of government in and around the president or prime minister. To those who worry that this gives too much power into the hands of the leader, and we cannot be sure of the consequences of such a concentration of power, I say, if we're unsure of the leader, we shouldn't support them. But there is no case I know of where a government has changed a country for the better without strong and effective leadership at the center. With such a center built, you can then fan out the same lessons to ministries. But a president or prime minister without efficient capability on policy and strategy, delivery and communication will, in my experience, not achieve much. What's more, the ministries need that strong direction at the center to be empowered to make changes themselves. Often the problems in these countries cross departmental boundaries. The agriculture ministry depends on the roads ministry, or the schools ministry depends on the energy ministry. Only the center can drive such cooperation properly. Second, we have to help countries prioritize. I mean, this is correct for its own sake. So, for example, Nigeria is right to focus on the power sector. Get that working, everything else has possibility. Fail on that, and little is going to move. But it's also correct for another reason. The minute I see a government plan for a ministry with 30 priorities in it, I know nothing will happen. The political energy is too diffuse. And these priorities, of course, should be their priorities and not ours. Which brings me to my third point. Why China has had such an impact. And leave aside whether we agree with it or not. That's for another debate. Let us understand why they have the influence. It's not only money. It's that they ask the country what the country needs and supply it. Usually it is infrastructure, roads, power, even functioning government buildings. And they do it. Now we can do it too, but we have to work on the things the country judges to be vital, which are not always and necessarily the same things that get the biggest cheer back in our home legislature. Now, none of that means that we don't push on areas we sensibly think are priorities, like health and education, Sierra Leone and Liberia, where we're working. But our priorities have to connect with theirs, and that's what we mean by country ownership. Fourth, I think we have to be the champions of quality private sector investment. The work that the World Bank and the IFC are doing here is really important. When we got over 1,000 people to come to Sierra Leone's first ever London Investment Conference, I actually knew we were going to get somewhere. And indeed we did. We got hundreds of millions of dollars worth of investment out of it. Or when in 2010, Rwanda rose up the rankings more than any other nation in the world, actually, as a place to do business. Big, respectable companies bring more than investment. They bring, properly done, intellectual capital, and they give confidence to others. And they can also help spin off smaller businesses. Fifth, they will only come, however, if minimum requirements on the judicial system and the rule of law are in place. And here again, I think we need a really special focus. For many African countries, even the basics on law and order would make a difference. And there is a vast expertise internationally on what creates a functioning civil police force and at least a framework for commercial justice. Indeed, in another part of my work with the Palestinian Authority, we work precisely on these issues with them. And what is remarkable is how much expertise there is out there that can be brought to bear. For understandable reasons, some African countries struggling to emerge from conflict have put a major emphasis on building their army and their security forces. But actually, for many ordinary citizens, and of course, for would-be expatriates that come and work there, traveling the streets of the capital free from fear is a prerequisite of a confident future. It's actually a proper, non-corrupt civic police that they need. And here is the sixth point. The capacity in all areas that we have to build requires a deep level of practical expertise. The good news is that this expertise exists. The challenge is I think we can do so much more to use it in the development field. What we found in AGI's work is that there is this huge untapped resource out there in the wealthy nations for precisely the expertise that African countries often require. There are analysts and experts from major private sector companies who would eagerly accept the prospect of 1 to 2 years working in Africa with a level of political responsibility and practical responsibility they would never attain back home. They are well-trained, smart, above all, well-motivated. Then there is a legion of the retired, the people who might be in their 60s, have enormous experience of practical problem solving at the top ranks of business or government, and they would love a chance to be involved. Just recently, when we were helping one of our countries negotiate a commercial contract about resources, we came across a top London lawyer, a partner at one of the best city firms, and he agreed to come and help. The difference just one really qualified person made to negotiating that contract was extraordinary. And I bet there are large numbers of people out there who would be very happy to help, and we should access them. Which brings me to the seventh point. Building capacity only works if those engaged are not fly-in, fly-out consultants, but people willing to work alongside the locals and transfer the know-how. And actually, of all the things we've done, this has been the most heartening aspect. In each case, as AGI has continued our work, there's been developed a really good team of people at the center who are nationals of the country. Some will come back from abroad, but others have grown up living and working there. And I think this is how capacity building has to work. Training up those that when the outside workers move on, then retain the skills to carry on with the same level of expertise. And this training, by the way, in my view, works best when it is done on the job, so to speak, sitting alongside, working alongside each other. The aim, of course, is to build long-term sustainable capacity. But here's the thing, I think this is often best achieved, in my experience, by working on specific priorities in the real-life conditions of government. By the way, this skills audit need not stay with the technical expertise. There are also retired political leaders and ministers, and I'm one. And we can help interact with the political leadership of the country. And this is not just about the sort of weird club of politicians, but it's also by virtue of a common experience, you can have a different insight into how change can be brought about in the often harsh terrain of real politics. So all of this is deeply practical. I mean, as you'll notice from what I'm saying, I'm really going through things that are very, very granular. But I think it does add up to a somewhat different but absolutely necessary approach to the fundamental question of how we bring about effective government in countries that have not had effective government in the past. And I know many will say, well, all of this is fine, but it won't make up for situations where there is a democratic or transparency deficit, or where there's corruption, or where there are tribal or ethnic tensions that can predominate. And this is absolutely true. However, I do think effective governance has a firm read across to what we normally call good governance. The problem for many struggling nations is that their people, after years of poor governance, no progress, or worse, regression, they actually lose faith in the political process. So then, electing a government, even with a democratic system, can be like a transaction, because that's how the system works. An interplay of tribal, ethnic, or just vested interests. This is what can change in Africa today, and is changing. When people see improvements taking place as a result of government decisions, their sense that politics is about changing lives and not just changing rulers takes root. And it is at that point that they see corruption, not as an inevitable consequence of an inevitably broken system, but as a brake on their aspirations that is neither inevitable nor indeed acceptable. So that's where I think there is a link between effective governments and democratic, accountable, and transparent governments. And if we can show people that government works and delivers real change, in the end that breaks across all those other dividing lines that otherwise dominate the political calculus of the nation. So, I think this is an incredibly exciting time to be in the development field. And there are great people, like many here today, who have long experience and extraordinary commitment in this area. And then you are joined by new leaders. And together, there is that new sense of purpose. There are new players in the NGO, charitable, and private sector. And all of this is creating a new sense of possibility and therefore hope. None of this means the challenges aren't enormous or that there won't be many setbacks. But the hope is real. The changes are tangible. And above all, the desire on the part of Africa for its destiny to be in African hands is palpable and invigorating. In my judgment, this could be Africa's century. It should be. And to play even a very small part in making that happen is a great privilege. Thank you.
I think they want me.
Whoops, sorry. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Blair. I just want to say, first I need to mention that if you would like to ask a question, there are already a bunch of questions. There is already a bunch of questions, so you've already announced to pass your index card into the aisle. Please indicate your name and your affiliation. Then I just want to say thank you for that speech and for being here. I just had two quick thoughts about how wonderful it is. I don't think we should take for granted that we have a former head of state of one of the world's most powerful nations talking about development and Africa. It's in itself, it's very exciting. And second, I don't think that there are very many people who could bring the kind of eloquence and elegance to a speech that is really trying to bring along the world to the reality that effective government is about practical nuts and bolts getting things done. So I thank you for those things. Now, I do have one question I wanted to ask, which you don't need to answer because I don't want to take you away from the practical nuts and bolts. But it's somewhat related, and it's that in the summer, when President Obama celebrated 50 years of independence on many countries in Africa, he did not invite any of the African heads of state to come. So there was some discussion about that in the press. Why didn't he do that? He had people asserted, well, he had said that leadership is about the kinds of things you're talking about, not about, it's about institutions and not about strong men. So the question really is, it goes back to points you've already referred to. How does the outside world best deal not only with the positive work that you're doing where it's possible to do that with leadership that has taken responsibility, but what's the best way to deal with those states, perhaps, for example, Cote d'Ivoire today, where there is the issue that there isn't yet clarity on who is the effective leader, who could be?
Well, first of all, Nancy, thank you very much for those kind words at the outset. Though I should say I was not a head of state, I was head of government.
It's true.
Because it's just the Queen, you see, it's a
queen.
sort of Queen thing. Otherwise, when I go back, it'll be to the Tower of London rather than to my normal place of residence, so I've got to watch that.
I was dreadfully American in that sense. And I kind of knew it was as I was saying it. Anyway, my apologies to the Queen.
I'll sort it out with her. No, I think the work that we do obviously can only be done in circumstances where a country's got a relative situation of stability. But I do think we from the outside should be prepared to be very clear about how we are going to try and enforce certain rules, because what's happening in Cote d'Ivoire is obviously tragic. I hope they can sort it out in the next period of time. But one of the things we faced when Sierra Leone was in the grip of the conflict, and we actually then intervened, and there was a lot of pressure on us at the time. People were saying, well, don't you have to come to sort of compromises and put them all together and all the rest of it? And I came to the conclusion very strongly in the end that no, actually what you really need to do is to make sure that the democratic system is upheld. And I think if that doesn't happen, it then becomes very hard afterwards to get the country really moving. So I'm not, the situation in Cote d'Ivoire at the moment is very uncertain and unsure, but I think basically from the outside world, we shouldn't just kind of leave that to one side. I think it's important we focus on it and try and sort it out, because otherwise, you can end up with the country literally being held up for many years as a result of not taking those decisions properly.
I don't have a name and affiliation, but
many came without names.
What will you do if the leaders you are supporting become, that's the same question. Well, what will you do if the leaders you are supporting now become corrupt or dictatorial? How will you know when to pull out? I think this is a general question, not only for your program, the African Governance Initiative, but for the aid community in general.
Yeah, it's a real challenge, this, because I think, frankly, for the work we do, we couldn't stay in those circumstances. It would be very difficult.
It doesn't make any sense at all.
I don't think so. Now, you can have debates, and one of the countries we work in, for example, Rwanda, there's been a lot of controversy about that. Now, my view is that we are right to support those. We're not ignoring those issues, but we are right to support the president there and the work that he's doing. But there are countries, frankly, that we couldn't go into, and the countries we are in, we don't, as it were, say it's a blank check and that's, you know, we're just going to stay regardless. I think that the other thing is that often the aid community has to be there for the sake of the people, right? So that's, but the work we do, I think, is very specific to the concept of proper governance. And so, you know, we are very conscious of that dilemma and very keen to make sure that we move, you know, we're helping a country move in the right direction. The only thing I think is true, because, you know, if you take Rwanda, which has recovered from the genocide and is in a very, very difficult situation, therefore, is I also do look and track at how the country is moving, and a country like that has actually made dramatic improvements in the last few years. So, you know, I think it is important to support that. But, you know, that dilemma is there, and we certainly watch it very, very carefully. But you see, I think the other thing that's really interesting about this is that there comes a certain point at which the democratic and the effective do fit together. Because past a certain point, you know, I'm not a supporter of the benign dictator thesis. I mean, some who remember my leadership of the Labour Party may wonder about that statement, but basically, you know, basically, I think the democratic process is a vital part of it. The thing is, I do think, though, that when countries are emerging from a period of conflict, or in the case of Rwanda, genocide, you have to be sensitive.
Forbearance,
well,
or something like that.
I'm not sure I'd choose that word, but I think you have to be aware that it is happening in a context where the stability of the country is still quite fragile.
Mm-hmm. And of course, Rwanda is a very interesting case of what you were talking about near the end, that if you can show effective government, that you begin to create a sense amongst the people of how they can hold their own government accountable.
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting things that's happening in Sierra Leone, where we're working at the moment, and these are sort of basic things we're helping the getting done, like, you know, so the lights going on in Freetown. Now, right. I know that may seem, well, you know, does that really, really matter? But yes, of course, it really matters once people notice that, you know, or we've just been helping deliver a maternal mortality and child mortality program, which is literally, I mean, the numbers of young kids getting treated in hospital has more than doubled, right? So it's gone from 100,000 to just over 250,000. The impact of that is enormous. Now, some of those children would have maybe been all right anyway, but the fact is, and there's still an enormous distance to go in the quality of care given and so on. But this is a very interesting example of what I'm saying. The money was there, but the system to deliver it wasn't. And some of these things, you know, if you look at, for example, agriculture and how you deliver agriculture policy today, you know, there's an expertise there, things to do with logistics and, you know, things that are regularly done in many organizations, but if a government's just beginning its process of change, it often doesn't have any effective levers to deliver these things. So you could even have the aid money there, but it's not necessarily going effectively to be used.
Okay, I think two related questions. How will you monitor, this is from John Hinklin at the IMF, how will you monitor and evaluate the work of the AGI? John is in the evaluation part of the IMF.
Right.
He's a former visiting fellow at CGD. And a related question that I was talking about actually with Kate, your AGI person, how to engage the African diaspora, how will AGI tap this pool of skill? I think you already addressed that question, but maybe you could talk a little bit more about tapping the skills of the diaspora.
Yeah, look, I think how we evaluate our work is very simple. I mean, one general, one particular. The general is the country moving forward, right? Is its economy developing? Are the public services improving and so on? Because we work very specifically in and around the president building that capacity. But the second thing is we work in specific areas, so we will work alongside delivering specific priorities. So we can see if we've delivered or helped deliver the child mortality program or the agriculture program or the energy program of a power production program of the country. So we actually set very specific deliverables, and then we have them also independently evaluated.
That's why you like cash on delivery. For those who know me, they'll know that I couldn't resist.
Yeah, well,
putting that in.
But you do. It's a really important part of this, of the pressure on the government and also the pressure on us to make sure that what we're doing is effective. But the other way, I'm not sure we can measure this in quite the same way, but I'll tell you the single most exciting thing, and this is particularly true because we only began the last year working in Liberia, but certainly in the work we've done in Rwanda and Sierra Leone, there is now a group of nationals, as it were, the local people there, who are doing what our folk were doing. And here's the good news. They are really smart, good people there. But you see, I know this may sound a really trivial thing to say. One of the things that we did an analysis for one of our people, and we showed that, because sometimes people don't even have the very basic things around the president. Scheduling. I mean, I know it sounds almost trivial, but we actually did an analysis that showed that the particular individual, 90% of their time was spent on things other than their priorities. Now, actually, this is common to Western leaders too, in certain regards. And actually, I think it's one of the big problems of modern politics, in fact. However, 90% is a little too much time to be spending on things other than your priorities. Now, by building now those things are quite hard to measure, but by building effective instruments, just of this is what this is how we're going to map out your time. For example, what we do is we introduce concepts of stock take. So what we do is we work with the president to achieve their priorities, and there may be, say, 4, right? Because I basically believe in many of these countries, you want to really strip it down to the absolute essentials, and then we say, right, we're going to put in place a system that allows evidence analysis and your time sitting with the ministers. Because my experience, again, is that unless the president or the prime minister is actually sat there helping do it, it doesn't get done. And on the diaspora, I think there's lots of great work being done by many people, not least Ed and George Soros and others, to attract the diaspora back. But here's what people who are attracted back from the diaspora always say to me. They say, if I'm going to work in a proper system, I'm prepared to commit. But if you're going to chuck me in a piece of chaos, then frankly, I'm not really interested in that, because I've got a life to live and I've got a family. So I think these things are linked. There is the enormous talent in the diaspora, but they need to have a little faith in governing systems before they're going to put the whole of their lives on the line for it. In the 3 areas where we're working there, we've had really good people come back from the diaspora and make a difference.
I am remembering, I don't know if I'll have this right, but the Scott Family Fellows in Liberia, at least a large number of them came from the diaspora, and at least one has become a deputy minister and presumably is staying. So that point is absolutely right. Let me do a question from Reese Scott. What role does faith play in promoting the kind of leadership that you are advocating?
You mean in the country itself? I think, the faith communities obviously can be very active in this, and for example, things like healthcare, there are large amounts of that are actually delivered by faith communities. I also think, though, that this interaction between the governments and civic society, which very often means the faith community, can be incredibly important in building support for proper systems of governance and for keeping government itself honest. And I've noticed really important work being done by the faith communities, and I think faith for some of the leaders as well, and their immediate associates, that interaction with the faith community is very important.
Here's a good one about Nigeria that refers to a former visiting fellow, or currently still sort of visiting fellow at the center, Nuhu Ribadu. Yesterday, anti-corruption crusader Nuhu Ribadu announced his candidacy for president of Nigeria. His hope is to challenge the ruling elite through an Obama-like grassroots campaign. Question: how can organizations like yours and others help create the space and opportunity for candidates like Nuhu to emerge in Africa and truly compete for the people's vote?
Right. First of all,
Can't do everything.
No.
I think that's an okay answer.
Right. And,
you need focus and priorities.
Yeah. And by the way, of course, who the Nigerians choose is for the Nigerians. But I think that I mean, we actually in the Sierra Leone context, for example, we specifically did work with them on setting up an effective anti-corruption unit. That is busy at work, and can need to be. But I think, you know, I think what we really focus on, frankly, is creating the sense that if people are competing for government, then they're going to have a system there that can deliver for people, right? Now, and I think anti-corruption, as I say, is part of that, and I think. Look, the problem with corruption, apart from the obvious problem with corruption, is that, I think that's yours, Nancy, isn't it?
Yes, it stopped. It's okay.
Well, I have to tell you, which is a bit alarming, that Lawrence is now rifling through your handbag, but we're about to have some embarrassing revelations here, but.
It's my daughter.
Oh, right.
It's okay.
Good. Well, do take it if it's. Yeah. Where were we?
I apologize.
No, that's all right. No, I think the problem with corruption, other than the obvious one, is that it results in really bad decisions. I mean, I know that it seems a slightly odd thing to say, but. You see, I think in the resource area, one thing I think on corruption, by the way, is you need to know where to start. And I personally think for a lot of the African countries, the resource sector is a really important sector where you put a light on the corruption issue. Because especially now, frankly, where there's a big competition to develop resources, and where, after all, I mean, because this is the irony, indeed the tragedy of many African countries, is they're rich countries with poor people. If these decisions are taken badly or wrongly on resources, and who gets to develop them, it's devastating for the country. And actually, worse than that, you can even find that the resources that you have, for example, oil or gas or something, turns out in fact, to be a negative, believe it or not, for the nation because of what comes with it. So that's where I think it's really, really important. And that's where I think also, by the way, the international community's got to be pretty tough on all that. Because the fact is, if a country has a natural resource that it could develop well with the right partners and the proper transparency and the proper contract, then it could yield enormous benefit for the country. So if that goes bad, that is a devastating blow to the effectiveness of the country.
We actually have a proposal at the center that we've been working on, which would encourage donors and government leaders in resource-rich countries in Africa and elsewhere to use more of the income in the way that Alaska and the Alberta province in Canada have used it, and was proposed briefly in Nigeria for at least one part of Nigeria, namely to have per capita distribution of at least some, if not all, of the net income. Then there would have to be a tax system, presumably, that created some sense of accountability on the part of taxpayers to tax back some of it for major investments. Do you have a thought about that? Maybe we could get you to help us
I think also think
that through more.
Yeah, interesting. No, I think that is one issue, and for example, Norway also has an interesting way of using its revenue. But I think the other thing is this is where, you know, Ed and I have discussed this on a number of occasions too. I mean, maybe it's different in other countries, but in the countries I've worked, this absence of a great negotiating team with experience of negotiating these types of contracts is a big problem for them. And yet the expertise is there. And what we're doing now is we're putting out feelers to all sorts of people in the legal and financial network to see if they're prepared to help in this. Because the other thing that really matters is if you've got a great team negotiating it who have real expertise, one, it actually makes corruption quite hard because they're tracking it, but two, the country gets a better deal. Because I've come across resource deals in some of these countries which are, you know, frankly appalling. Now, you don't know whether there's corruption gone into it or not, but there's certainly negligence gone into it. So, I mean, I think that is something really worth us looking at. And you see, what I'm trying to suggest in a way is that those of us in government and in the development community look upon ourselves as kind of enablers, so that what we can do sometimes, and this is not a traditional role for development departments, but what we can do is we can enable or bring together people from the outside whose expertise we can use, right? And we do that, and we go out and we organize that. I mean, this is what I'm suggesting, because I think you could get you know, just to give you another example from one of our countries, we've been discussing with one of them, because they've got a whole lot of investment opportunities coming to them. And the head of we helped reorganize their investment, inward investment operation. But he came to us when I was over there the other day and said, look, give me 3 or 4 analysts from a financial institution who know how to make these deals happen. Right. He said, I've got all these things coming in, but I need some execution capacity here. I need to better get things done. You know, so try and get me that. Now, I think we can play a bigger part in trying to you know, to organize and access that capacity.
We don't have too much time. I'm not sure how we're doing. Let me give you a couple of questions. And I have one myself, it's more of a comment. And then see, you pick and choose. One is from Patrick Flanagan, who is a student here at Johns Hopkins SAIS. In terms of your work in the development field, is there anything you regret not doing or trying harder at while Prime Minister? And another interesting one on without attribution is, would you advise President Obama to make USAID independent of the State Department and elevate it to a cabinet level post? I don't know how much you're still a politician. You're awfully funny, so I'm sure you'll find a way to deal with these. And let me mention my comment, and maybe you'll want to say something about that, which is, it's actually a suggestion, a request, in all humility. When in the development community we use the word capacity building, we imply, I think, too often that the capacity isn't there. And you've made the point very strongly that people who are talented are there, but they often are operating in dysfunctional systems, which make it hard for them to be effective. But you've also made the point that sometimes an expert at the right time, of the right kind, possibly from outside, can matter. I think it would be great if we could all find another way to talk about this that doesn't use the terminology capacity building. In the traditional aid community, as you know, where they're not as forward-looking as you and haven't thought it through in the way you have because of your experience, it boils down to the sort of chestnut of training, sitting fees, consultants. So that's my comment and request. But do go back to Obama, USAID independent, and what you wish you'd done more of. when you had to be a politician also in the UK, and you couldn't always have your priorities around
Right.
the key issues.
Well, first of all, on the USAID, look, I know I've been out of office for just over 3 years now, but I'm not completely out of practice, okay? So I do know a question not to answer when I see one.
Very good. I knew
Yeah.
you'd be funny, too.
Yeah, no, yeah, my meeting with the secretary should be really interesting if I answer that one the right way. But I will say that Yaman Rashad, I think, is doing a great job. It's a great appointment. It's a really good appointment. And that's all I'm going to say. Right. Now, on the rest of it, on what I would have done in government differently.
On development issues.
Yeah, I think.
No, that was the question.
Yeah.
That was the question.
No, because otherwise it's too long a list and you haven't got all day. I think it's a bit the same as many other aspects of government. I think by the time we got to the Gleneagle Summit in 2005, I actually was very proud of what we did there, and proud also of the partnership part. Because the other thing we did was establish the Africa Commission, which the extraordinary Bob Geldof was a driving light on, and what that did was very much put along peer reviews on governance and things. So this was a partnership. Mm-hmm. I think when we were first in office, we were a bit slowed. It was all about aid and not enough about partnership. So, and I also think, I mean, just one personal credit, had we been able to do more, I think, on the Zimbabwe front, I would have been very pleased, but it was just difficult to do. So I guess, you know, yeah, of course there are lessons, but here's, I think, the sort of bigger point, really, that I would make about this. Because I think what's odd about government, this is a far more general point, is, you know, as I say in my book, and thank you for the plug, by the way, you know, when I came into office, Prime Minister was the only job I ever held, right? So I'd never been a government minister before, and then you're Prime Minister, and running the country. And what I've actually learned over the 10 years is that the business of running government, it's, believe it or not, it's like anything else. I mean, why I'm surprised, or why I was surprised, is itself interesting and rather absurd, because it is like anything else. You get better at it the longer you do it, in fact, or you certainly learn more about how to do it. And you don't, there are lessons out there that had they come to me in a sort of identifiable form, would have been quite useful to know.
Right.
You know, so
yeah.
When you start to deal with, for example, how you're reforming, in my case it was education systems and healthcare and law and order systems, you know, I knew so much more by the end of when I got into my second term, I was so much more attuned and able to start looking at the systemic change that was necessary in those things. And part of the purpose of what we're trying to do, but I think, you know, this has got a more general application, is to try and accelerate that learning process, mm-hmm. right?
Which is absolutely critical in some countries where the results have to be
Yeah, and funnily enough,
produced.
It's critical in every country, but in those countries where you know, you're dealing with the very basics, they're incredibly important. And so what we find when we're sitting alongside, because the team I have people usually work maybe in US government or British government, or they might work for sort of McKinsey's or the private sector, but the thing is, someone taught them, right? And therefore, what we find when we're working alongside, say, the president's team, is the president's team may be perfectly smart and capable people, but they've never been sensitized to the fact that actually today in most governments there are different ways of doing it. You take communication, for example, which matters in every situation today. It's got to be organized. It doesn't just happen. Mm-hmm. So I think that's really it's
the business of government that...
And the business of government today really, really matters, because funnily enough, the ideology of government, I'm not saying there's not a lot of that around, but it's amazing how often that can get in the way of just focusing on what is the most effective way of doing things.
Bravo. Let me say to our participants that there were a lot of questions. I see a big fat stack. And what we'll do is we'll share them all with the African Governance Initiative people, and we'll put them, with your permission, on the Center for Global Development website, okay, with some sort of discretion about what's okay to from them and from us. Let me congratulate you for really bringing a new idea about what it means to be practical and how to be helpful in that area, and the focus on leadership. I don't think there's anybody else that could have brought it, as I said, with the same eloquence and elegance, and I wish you and your colleagues at the African Governance Initiative much luck and success in pushing forward this. I think it should infuse the entire development community over the years, and you have begun that process. You can certainly accomplish it. Could I ask everyone to join with me in thanking Mr. Blair?